HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Riven Rock by T.C. Boyle. Read by Michael Kirby. Sex is a talent, and I do not have it. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Of Love and Other Demons. Prologue, 1927. World Without Women.
For 20 years, 20 long, dull, repetitive years that dripped by with the sleepy, incessant murmur of water dripping from a gutter, Stanley McCormick never laid eyes on a woman. Not his mother, not his sisters, not his wife. No nurse or librarian, no girl in pigtails on her way to school, no spinster sweeping her porch or housewife haggling with a grocer, no slut, flapper, or suffragette. It wasn't a matter of choice. Stanley loved his mother, his wife, his sisters. He loved other people's mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters. But he loved them too much. Loved them with an incendiary passion that was like hate, that was indistinguishable from hate. And it was that loving and hating that fomented all his troubles and thrust him headlong into a world without women. He was 29 when he married Katherine Dexter, a woman of power, beauty, wealth, and prestige, a woman as combative and fierce as his mother, with heartbreaking eyes, and a voice so soft and pure it was like a drug, and he was 31 when he first felt the cold wolf's bite of the sheet restraints and entered the solitary world of men. He went blank then. He was blocked. He saw things that weren't there, desperate, ugly things, creatures of his innermost mind that shone with a life more vivid than any life he'd ever known. And he heard voices speaking without mouths, throats or tongues, and every time he looked up, it was into the face of masculinity. The years accumulated. Stanley turned 40, then 50. And in all that time he lived in the company of one sex and one sex only. Men, with their hairy wrists and bludgeoning eyes, their nagging, phlegmy voices and fetid breath, and the viscid sweat that glistened in their beards and darkened their shirts under the arms. It was like joining a fraternity that never left the house, entering a monastery, marching in step with the French Foreign Legion over the vast and trackless dunes, and not an oasis in sight. And how did Stanley feel about that? No one had bothered to ask. Certainly not Dr. Hamilton, or Dr. Hawk, or Dr. Brush, or Dr. Meyer either. But if he were to think about it, think about the strangeness and deprivation of it even for a minute, he would feel as if a black and roiling gulf were opening inside him, as if he were being split in two, like a Siamese twin cut away from its other self. He was a husband without a wife, a son without a mother, a brother without sisters. But why? Why did it have to be like this? Because he was sick. He was very sick. He knew that. And he knew why he was sick. It was because of them. Because of the bitches. Because of women. They were the ones. And if he ever saw his wife again, if he saw his mother, or Anita, or Mary Virginia, he knew what he would do, as sure as the sun rises and the world spins on its axis. He would go right up to them, Katherine or Mary Virginia, or the president's wife or any of them, and he would show them what a real man was for. And he would make them pay for it, too. He would. That was how it was. And that was why he'd lived for the past 19 years at Riven Rock, the 87-acre estate his father's money had bought him, in his stone mansion with the bars on the windows and the bed bolted to the floor, within sight of the hammered blue shield of the Pacific, of the adamantine wall of the Channel Islands, in the original paradise, the lonely paradise, the place where no woman walked or breathed. Part 1. Dr. Hamilton's Time. 1. How his hand came into contact with her face, her sweet, plump, irritating little burr of a wifely face that found a place beside his each night on the connubial pillow, was as much a mystery to O'Kane as the scalloped shell of the sky and the rain that fell as one angry, inveterate thing over all this weary part of the earth. It wasn't late, not 10 o'clock yet, and he wasn't angry, not yet anyway. On the contrary, he'd been celebrating, polluting himself, as she would say, living it up, for he's a jolly good fellow, and 3 cheers for this one and that one, and rah, rah, rah. Celebrating with Nick and Pat and Mart, and with Dr. Hamilton, yes, with him too. Celebrating the rest of his life that had just been turned on like an electric switch, flooding him with light that poured from his nostrils and ears and his mouth, and no doubt his rectum too, though he hadn't yet had occasion to look down there. But he would eventually. And then he had come home, and there she was, stalking the sitting room like a bristling, tireless little rat-gnawing thing, all primed and ready to pounce. He hadn't meant to hit her, and he'd hit her only once, or maybe twice before. And the thing was, he wasn't even angry, just irritated and tired, drained to the core. The noise she made, and the baby squalling in the back room, and the way she kept thrusting her face at him as if it was a volleyball, tanned, stitched, and puffed up to regulation pressure. And she wouldn't let him have this, not even this, after all the gut-wrenching and indecision it had cost him over the past 2 months. And when the inflated ball of her face had come at him for maybe the 50th time, he slammed it right up and over the net, just as if he was still in school and diving for a low one on the hard-foot compacted turf of the volleyball court. That opened her up all right, and there was no peace for him after that. She was like an artesian well, a real gusher, tears and blood and rage exploding at him, and all he could think of, dodging away from that streaming face till he was so drained and exhausted he toppled into the blackness deeper than the last dying wink of consciousness, was Mrs. McCormick, Katherine. And what a lady she was. And Rosaline stuck to him like flypaper and howling till the windows went to pieces and the roof collapsed, and the whole drugged and dreaming town fell away into some deep fissure of the earth. Earlier that day, in the morning, it had been different. He'd awakened at first light and saw her there beside him, the soft petals of her eyelids and her lashes and lips and the fragile composition of her face, and he thought about kissing her, leaning over and brushing his lips against the down of her cheek. But he didn't. He didn't want to wake her, or his son either. It was too peaceful, the submarine light, the stealthy tick of the clock, the rudiments of bird noise. And he didn't want to have to talk to her about the McCormicks and the meeting and what he feared and what he hoped. He hardly knew himself. He stripped off his flannels at the side of the bed and slipped naked into the sitting room with his good Donegal tweed over one arm and a fresh suit of underwear over the other, and dressed like a thief of clothes. Then he was out the door and into another life. The year was 1908, and he'd just turned 25. He was a hair under 6 feet, with the pugilist's build he'd inherited from his father, who put the prototype to good use in a series of mostly victorious bare-knuckled fights in the 90s, and his mother's wistful sea-green eyes, with the 2 hazel clock hands implanted in the right one, inflexibly pointing, for this lifetime at least, to 3 o'clock. His mother had always told him that chronometric eye would bring him luck, great luck and fortune. And when he questioned her, skeptical even at 10 and 11, she just pointed to the proof and insisted that the hour was preordained. "But what about you?" he would say, lifting his eyes to the colorless walls of the 4 rooms they shared with his grandmother, his Uncle Billy, his 4 sisters and 3 cousins. "Where's your 3 o'clock luck?" And she would frame his face with her hands, the softest touch in the world, and whisper, "It's right here between my hands." The morning flew. He'd started off at the White Street house where they'd installed Mr. McCormick to get him away from the disturbing influence of the other patients, and then he'd gone on to McLean, and now he was late, cutting across the lawn out front of the administrative building on a day that was like a wet dish rag, though it was the last week of April and he would have sacrificed to the gods to see a ray of sun. He was late and hurrying, and he didn't give a damn for the fact that he'd left his hat and overcoat back in the nurse's common room, and the cuffs of his good Donegal tweed trousers were soaking up the damp like a pair of fat swollen sponges tied to his ankles. He should have, because when the tailor came over from Ballyshannon and settled into the rooming house down the street from them, and his mother said he should take advantage of the opportunity and have one nice suit made because if he ever hoped to work with his brains instead of his back, he'd have to look like one of the quality. He'd laid out $18 for it. $18 in good hard Yankee coin he'd earned at the Boston Lunatic Asylum, scraping blood, vomit, and worse off the walls. And here it was, wet through in the shoulders and crawling up his shins, and sure as the devil it was going to shrink. But what did he care? It was 2 minutes to 11. The hair was hanging wet in his eyes, and Dr. Hamilton was waiting for him. If things worked out, he could buy 6 suits. It wasn't like him to be late. It was unprofessional, and Dr. Hamilton was a stickler for the 3 Ps, as he called them: punctuality, propriety, and professionalism. And O'Kane, already wrought up, felt like a piece of fat in the fryer as he charged across the wet lawn. He was sweating under the arms, and the hair was dangling like rope in his face. It wasn't like him, but he was behind his time because he'd gotten distracted over at White Street, and then in the back ward, and all because of the apes. Apes and monkeys, that is. They were all he could think about. And it was funny, too, because this was the kind of day that got the violence stirred up. It wasn't just the full moon. It was any change in the weather, even from perpetual gloom to a driving downpour. And as he hurried across the lawn, he could hear Katsakis, the mad Greek, and the one they called the Apron Man, hooting at one another from the Maximum Ward, hooting just like apes. Violence he knew inside and out. He ought to after 7 years in the profession. But his experience with hominoids, as Dr. Hamilton called them, was limited. And why wouldn't it be? South Boston, Danvers, and Waverly weren't exactly tropical jungles. In fact, aside from the usual boyhood encounters with the organ grinder's monkey, the sideshow at the circus, the zoo, and that sort of thing, he'd only come within spitting distance of an ape once, and that was in a barroom. He'd gone into Donnelly's one afternoon for a pint and a chat, and when he looked up from his beer, there was a man sitting beside him at the counter with a one-eyed chimpanzee on a leash. For a shot of rye whiskey and a beer chaser, the man got the chimp to pull out his organ and piss in a beer glass, and then drink it down as if it was the finest 86 proof Irish, and smack his lips to boot. When the man had chased his 3rd shot, he gave a look up and down the bar and said he would challenge anybody in the place to arm wrestle the thing for $50. This scrawny, half-bald, one-eyed little monkey that stank like all the souls in hell boiled in their own juice and then left out in the sun for a week after that. And there was a lot of elbowing and obscene commentary from the patrons as they worked themselves up to it. Finally, Frank Leary, a big square-headed loud-mouthed bull of a man who worked for the railroad, took him up on it, and the thing pinned Leary's wrist to the bar in half a second and wouldn't let go of his hand till there were tears in his eyes. The experience didn't exactly qualify O'Kane as a hominoid expert, as he would have been the first to admit, and he'd spent a painful hour in the library after work yesterday, squinting into an encyclopedia in the vain hope of learning something, anything, that might impress Mrs. McCormick, or, if not impress her, at least keep the level of humiliation down to a minimum if she suddenly took it into her head to grill him on the subject. The library was an alien place to O'Kane, damper than a Chinese laundry and 3 times as cold. The lighting hominoidally primitive and the illumination offered by the encyclopedia on the subject of apes nearly as dim. Apes, he read, are intelligent animals and are more closely related to man than any other living primates. They are popular zoo and circus animals. They also have figured widely in the legends and folk tales of many countries. After a while, he pushed himself up, replaced the book on the shelf, and ambled over to Donnelly's to fix this vast reservoir of knowledge in his brain, with the aid of a mnemonic whiskey or two. And now he was late, and his one good suit was crawling up his shins, and he was wondering how he was going to break the staggering news to Mrs. McCormick, the ice queen herself, that apes were popular zoo and circus animals. But as he reached the verge of the lawn and vaulted the retaining wall there, crossed the flagstone walkway, and started up the steps of the ad building, the multifarious marvel of his congested brain surprised him. The apes flew right out of his head, and he was thinking about California. Or he wasn't thinking about it, not exactly. He had a vision, a sudden vivid recollection of a place there, date palms shimmering beneath the golden liquefaction of the sun, and orange trees, with fruit like swollen buttocks and a little bungalow or whatever they called it snug in the corner. And this was odd, more than odd, since he'd never in his life been west of Springfield. It took him a minute to realize it must have been one of those orange crate labels he was calling up, the ones that make you want to throw down the snow shovel right that minute and catch the next train west. But there it was, real or illusionary, California, hanging in his head in all its exotic glory where the apes had been a moment before. And then, finally, as he stepped through the big beveled glass doors and into the dim paste wax and coal dust-smelling hall, he thought of his own Rosaline, his sorrow and his joy, his sweet, randy, pugnacious, clover-lipped bride of 3 months and mother of his green-eyed boy, Edward Jr. What was she going to think when he told her that they were moving to California for the sake of Mr. Stanley McCormick, late of the McCormick Reaper Works and the International Harvester Company, Mr. McCormick and a troop of apes? And what was her mother going to think, and her cauliflower-eared brothers, and her quibbling old stump of a father who'd wanted to skin him alive for getting her in trouble in the first place? As if it was all his fault, as if she hadn't seen her chance and taken it, and hadn't he done the right thing by her? And wasn't she at that very moment sitting snug in the walk-up on Chestnut Street, with her baby and her new curtains and everything else a woman could want? He passed by Dr. Cowell's office at a stiff-legged trot, swiping at his hair and wrestling with his tie, and trying to contort his shoulders to fit the sodden confines of the suit, and it was all he could do to flick a little wave at Miss Iannucci, Dr. Cowell's typewriter. Miss Iannucci was a spaghetti twister from Italy, who couldn't seem to find a shirt-waist big enough to accommodate her appurtenances, and who never ceased touching her lips and crossing and uncrossing her legs whenever O'Kane got a chance to stop in and chat with her, which was every time he passed by unless he was on his way to a fire. People were always grousing about the immigrants, the Italians this and the Polacks that, the Guineas and Wops and Bohunks, and his father was one of the most vocal and vehement, though he'd come over himself in an empty whiskey barrel aboard a transatlantic steamer not 30 years ago. But for his money they could let in all the Miss Iannuccis they wanted. And wouldn't that be a job, standing there at the bottom of the gangplank and passing judgment on this one or that? Nah, send her back. She's flat as an ironing board. Her? Yeah, we'll take her. Come on over here, miss, and step into the examining room a minute, won't you? A man could create an entire race, a whole new breed based on tits alone, or hips, or legs, or turned-up noses, and pinned-back ears. Look what they'd done with dogs. Anyway, he had to content himself with a wave this time because he knew how much this meeting meant to Dr. Hamilton, and to himself and Rosaline. And he hustled down the hall while Miss Iannucci stuck a finger in the corner of her mouth and sucked on it and crossed and uncrossed her legs and gave him the richest smile in all the world. 2 doors down, 3, and it was all he could do to keep from breaking into a run. He glanced up as he hurried past the portrait of John McLean, the decidedly unsmiling and bewigged philanthropist who'd given $100,000 back in 1818 to open the doors of this fair institution, and though he was late, though he looked like hell and the smells of fear and hope were commingled in his sweat, and his sweat was flowing as if it were the middle of July and he was carrying the entire McCormick family up a hill on his shoulders, apes and all, he couldn't help thinking, for just the fleetingest instant, of what he could do with $100,000. And it wouldn't be to endow any charitable organization, that was for sure, unless it was the Edward James O'Kane Benevolent and Fiduciary Fund. But enough of that. Suddenly he was there, at the far end of the hallway, breathing hard, 3 minutes past 11, half-soaked, sweating and wild-eyed, tapping respectfully at the smooth, varnished plane of Dr. Hamilton's door. He could detect the purl of conversation from within, and his heart sank. This was what he'd been fearing since he'd slipped out of the house and into the festering gray maw of the dawn. What he was afraid of, as he emptied bedpans and jerked rigid lunatics and simple morons down from the barred windows and up from the beds. She was there already, which meant he was late, officially. He cursed himself and tapped again, this time with a little more vigor, and felt even worse when the murmur broke off abruptly, as if he were interrupting something. There was an agonizing silence during which the wild thought that they were conspiring to leave him out of it altogether raced through his head. And then he heard Dr. Hamilton murmur, "That must be him now," and any trace of composure he might have been able to muster evaporated that instant. "Come in," the doctor called, and O'Kane felt his face flush as he pushed open the door and entered the room. The first thing he noticed was the fire, a lavish, crackling, devil-may-care blaze that played off the paneled walls and cast a soft glow on the doctor's collection of wax impressions of the human brain. The first fire O'Kane had ever seen in this particular fireplace, even in the dim frozen mist of January or February. But there it was, a fire to take the dampness out of the air and create a relaxed and cozy atmosphere, as Dr. Hamilton had no doubt calculated. It was a surprise, a real surprise, as was the tray of finger sandwiches, a teapot and the decanter of sherry set out on the low table in front of the settee. And O'Kane's estimation of Hamilton, already high, shot up another notch. "Oh, hello, Edward," the doctor purred, coming up off the edge of his desk to take O'Kane's hand and give it a squeeze. "We were just about to begin." Anyone watching this performance would have seen nothing but good nature and cordiality in that hand squeeze. But O'Kane felt the black blood of anxiety and irritation pulsing through the doctor's fleshless fingers and the damp recess of his palm. O'Kane was in the wrong. He was late. He'd violated the dictum of the 3 Ps and put everything in jeopardy. Despite all the doctor's warnings of the previous day, despite skipping breakfast and leaving the house early, and wearing his tweeds and collar under the hospital whites to save time and keeping the apes hurtling through the crowded jungle of his mind, limb by limb and minute by minute, he was late. He'd gotten off on the wrong foot, already. Awkward, red-faced, too big for his shrinking suit and towering over the room like some club-wielding troglodyte, O'Kane could only duck his head and mumble an apology. He saw that Mrs. McCormick was already there, the younger Mrs. McCormick, the wife, not the mother. She was running the show now, and the older Mrs. McCormick, Mr. McCormick's mother, was back in Chicago, sitting on her golden nest and laying her golden eggs, and counting up the dividends. As far as Stanley's, Mr. McCormick's, care was concerned, she'd left the field to the younger woman, for the moment at least. Since O'Kane wasn't wearing a hat or overcoat, it was just a matter of giving his tie a quick twist and bending from the waist to greet Mrs. McCormick, and the woman who seemed at that instant to have sprung up beside her on the settee. He was momentarily confused. It seemed he was always confused in Mrs. McCormick's presence, whether he was holding the door for her like a lackey as she stepped regally into the front hall at White Street, or trying his aphasic best to respond to one of the multi-tiered questions about her husband's progress, or lack of it. She was a society lady, that's what she was, cold as a walking corpse, all fur, feathers, and stone, and O'Kane wasn't part of society. Not by a long shot. He wasn't even part of the society that aspired to be part of society. He was a working man, son of a working man, grandson of a working man, and on all the way back to the apes, or Adam and Eve, whichever you believed in. Still, every time he saw her, locked in the cold, hard, glittering shell of her Back Bay beauty. It made him ache to be something he wasn't, to impress her or make her laugh or lean in close and whisper something filthy in her ear. And it took a tremendous effort of will simply to bend forward and touch his fingertips to her gloved hand, and then turn to the older woman beside her, a woman with a face like a squashed bird framed in the riot of feathers that was her hat, a woman he knew as well as his own mother but couldn't quite seem to. But then he was seated, in the chair closest to the fire, an inoffensive smile attached to his face, the sweat already starting up again under his arms, and he had a moment to catch his breath and let recollection come roaring back at him. This older lady, the one dressed like a funeral director's wife, was Mrs. McCormick's mother, Mrs. Dexter. Of course she was. Dr. Hamilton was saying something now, but O'Kane wasn't listening. He worked his neck muscles and twitched his shoulders till he caught Mrs. Dexter's attention and broadened his smile to a kind of blissful grimace. "And a good morning to you, Mrs. Dexter," he said, hearing his father's Killarney brogue creeping into his own booming, baleful voice, though he tried to fight it down. Dr. Hamilton paused in the middle of whatever he'd been saying to give him an odd look. "And to you, Mr. O'Kane," the old lady returned cheerily, and this seemed to reassure the doctor, so he went on. "As I was saying, Mrs. McCormick, if the terms are acceptable to you and your mother, of course, I think we have a bargain. I've spoken to Mrs. Hamilton and to the Thompson brothers, and they're all committed to the move, and to Mr. McCormick's care and welfare, of course. Edward here can speak for himself." O'Kane shifted in his seat. He hadn't understood till that moment just how much this whole thing meant to him. It was a new start, a new life, in a part of the country as foreign to him as the dark side of the moon. But that was just it. It wasn't dark in California, and it didn't snow, and there was no slush and drizzle, and there were no frozen clods of horse manure in the streets, and life there didn't grind you down till you barely knew you were alive. A single acre of oranges could make a man comfortable, oranges that practically grew by themselves, without even the rumor of work, once they were in the ground, and 10 acres could make a man rich. There was gold, there was oil, there was the Pacific, there was sun. "Oh, I'm committed all right," he said, trying to avoid the wife's eyes. How old was she anyway? She couldn't have been much more than 30, and here he was, a lusty, strong, big-shouldered, 190-pound Irishman from the North End, who routinely stared down the craziest of the crazy, and he was afraid to look her in the eye? He made an effort and raised his head to take in the general vicinity of her. "Even if it means forever." "And your wife, Mrs. O'Kane?" At first he thought the voice had come out of the ceiling, as voices tended to do for so many of the unfortunates on the ward. But then he realized that the old lady was moving her lips. He tried to look alert as the birdy face closed on him. "How does she feel about it?" "Rose?" The question took him by surprise. He saw his wife in the kitchen of the walk-up, stirring a pot of broth and potatoes, ignorant as a shoe, contentious and coarse and loud, but good-hearted as any girl you'd find, and the mother of his son. I guess I haven't told her yet, but she'll be thrilled. I know she will." "It'll mean leaving behind everything she knows. Her parents, her relations, her former schoolmates, the streets where she grew up," Mrs. Dexter persisted. "And what did she want from him anyway? They were both watching him, mother and daughter, and they were two birds, both of them, beaky and watchful, waiting for the faintest stirring in the grass. And where did you say she was from?" He hadn't said. He was tempted to say Beacon Hill to give an address on Commonwealth Avenue, but he didn't. "Charlestown," he mumbled, staring down at his wet and glistening shoes. He could feel the eyes of the younger one boring into him. "And for you, too," the old woman said. "Are you prepared to say goodbye to your own mother and father, and for as long as it takes for Mr. McCormick to be well again?"
Sample complete. Ready to continue?